Chapter 25. Brick by Brick. Vieille-Cotterêts, 1789. Thomas had always imagined heaven as a place where winged angels hovered over gilded clouds that looked like pearls. The floating marble fortress beyond the gates of St. Peter was a paradise of white and gold where everyone was young, wise, and robed in sinlessness. Yet his childish perceptions had been challenged since he arrived in Vieille-Cotterêts, for nothing in the world could possibly compare to the simple divinity of this ordinary moment. It was a beautiful Sunday afternoon, though admittedly a bit toasty under his forest green coat with white facings distinctive to the 6th Regiment. He was in the city market, perched atop Duchess. On the ground, lovingly patting the mare, was Marie-Louise. If a potentially rebellious meeting was to occur in town, he would be stationed to monitor, and she would be beside him as a rapt participant. Since the Bastille prison had been torn down, brick by brick, in Paris last month, Marie-Louise's revolutionary spirit had been untamable. Claude wasn't thrilled, but he had lost the ability to prevent her from attending the rallies. Whenever he tried, she simply snuck out, leaving the tavern unattended entirely. Eventually, Claude gave up and naively pretended that he didn't know where she was headed. At least he could take comfort in the knowledge that whenever she was at a protest, Thomas would keep a careful watch on her. The couple had also gotten more bold in their almost courtship, to the point that most people in town were clearly aware that the innkeeper's daughter had fallen in love with the tall, dark soldier from the colonies. However, the couple had never mustered the courage to say as much to one another. "It is a wonder that Colonel Roland let you pass inspection this morning," she joked. "Your shabraque is entirely uneven." She tugged his saddlecloth slightly. "Is it?" he replied, dismounting. He stood scandalously close, letting his arm brush hers ever so slightly. He removed his brass helmet with its distinctive black horsehair plume. "Could you hold this for a moment?" She nodded as he adjusted his horse's presentation with the precision and speed of a seasoned veteran. He was about to remount, but he decided to let Marie-Louise fiddle with his uniform a moment longer. They both knew there was nothing wrong with his livery. Thomas always presented himself with cleanliness and refinement, but Marie-Louise insisted on refastening a few of the brass buttons on his coat and polishing the inlaid number 6 that delicately adorned every button. She gestured to Thomas' breeches and crossbelt. "White is a beautiful hue, but don't you think a cavalry unit would save countless time on laundry if they chose a color that didn't stain so terribly?" "Probably." A notice in the market square caught his eye. "What is that?" He pointed at the parchment announcement. "I don't know if I have seen that one before." Usually, with each new posting from Paris, there was a riot in the streets, but this time only a few people seemed to give the proclamation much bother. Thomas and Marie-Louise walked up to the posting only to find it was months old, but had only just made its way north. The news only pertained to the colonies, which was likely why it had garnered so little notice. Most people in Vieille-Cotterêts had little interest in the New World. As a small town, few citizens could afford to have investments overseas. To Thomas, however, the words on the parchment were utterly momentous, and he was ashamed that nearly 6 months later, this was the first he was hearing of it. "Saint-Domingue," he whispered as he read it for the second time. According to the announcement, members of the National Assembly had passed a law granting voting rights to all free people of color in the colonies. "That's incredible." Marie-Louise looked at Thomas to see his reaction. "I've never voted in my life," Thomas muttered. "Really?" Marie-Louise sounded a little stunned. "I didn't think there was any law against it in France. You can vote here, can't you?" "Honestly, no one really knows. My friend Joseph said he tried a few times, but he was never allowed to. I guess I never bothered because I didn't want to stomach the disappointment." "I'm sorry," she said gently. If it's any comfort, I hardly think women's suffrage will be realized anytime soon." "No, I suppose not," Thomas replied. "But if women did vote, I think this country would implode." "And why is that?" Her eyes narrowed. She knew him well enough to know he was teasing, but her tone hinted that his next words should be spoken with extreme caution. "Well," he grinned, "France clearly isn't ready for brilliant ideas. If women voted, this whole place would turn on its head. You'd all run it much better. This poor country was not designed for logical progress." Yes," she said dryly. "We must protect the government's sacred right to remain in havoc. What would they do with themselves in Versailles if they actually considered the needs of the people? Can you imagine living in a world where the people could vote for their king instead of only local magistrates?" "A democracy. They do it in the United States," Thomas replied. "It sounds so surreal," she muttered back. As if on cue, Etienne briskly rode up to Thomas. "Dumas, you are required at Saint-Nicolas immediately. The colonel called an emergency meeting of the guard." "In the church? Why?" "I don't know. All I know is that it is urgent and secret. Quickly tell whoever you can find and get there immediately." Etienne cantered away to round up the remaining 6th Division. Thomas turned to Marie-Louise. "I guess I should go." "Sounds important," she agreed, patting the mare once more. She leaned up and whispered into his ear, her fingers gently gracing his shoulder. "Tell me later." Thomas tenderly placed his hand over hers, relishing the brief touch of her. "You know I can't share military secrets." "You are annoyingly honorable sometimes," she winked. Then he bowed to her and remounted his steed, spurring Duchess towards the church. It was monumental news indeed. The National Assembly had published a manifesto for their new government, the Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. Although the news hadn't made it to the populace yet, it was only a matter of time. The implications for the city, particularly when it came to keeping the peace, would be immense. The declaration granted new freedoms for the French people, offering a real possibility of representative government. Even through the ranks of the dragoons, the shockwaves were indisputable. Thomas couldn't wait to find a copy of the declaration to read in all of its glory, but it was unlikely to be printed in the local gazette until the morning. As soon as the news reached the people, the streets would inevitably erupt in celebration. However, the colonel predicted that the festivities were bound to quickly spiral into chaos beyond their control. Roland reported how other towns had set fire to government buildings, vandalized public property, and fought in the streets despite the overall jubilation among the populace. Thomas was lost in his thoughts as Roland continued to bark orders. This historic document could become the final tipping point for King Louis and his cabal of nobles. A new era for France was truly dawning. But were the dragoons, or France herself, ready for it? Their meeting lasted well over an hour as the statues of saints stared judgmentally from their parapets. Extra patrols would begin immediately. Thomas was assigned to begin his patrol starting well before dawn, so he was sent back to the Hôtel de l'Écu to rest and prepare. He stopped in the tavern for a coq au vin. Marie-Louise tried to subtly press him for a hint about the great secret, but Thomas held his silence. He ate quickly, kissed her hand goodnight, and went upstairs to get some sleep. Everything was about to change. Roland was correct. When Thomas arrived downstairs at 3:30 the next morning, he found many patrons already well into their cups celebrating the news, presumably having been there all night. By sunrise, celebrations and parades began in the market, but by mid-morning, the fighting had officially begun. Thomas was now obliged to use a level of force that he did not like exerting over the townsfolk. Unfortunately, the king demanded retribution. as the streets of France erupted with cries of dissent that threatened to tear the country to shreds. Although Thomas had much to clandestinely revel in with the new order, the extra effort at work did pose a definite drawback. Rushing all day across town to ameliorate the violence became utterly draining. Within a week, the gardens of 3 local chateaux were burned to the ground. On Tuesday, when the magistrate had been with Claude in the National Guard offices, his home was vandalized and his shrubberies were trimmed in a very childish and inappropriate manner. The rule of law and the expectations of their position became increasingly confusing as the lines blurred between who held authority and who the dragoons were meant to protect. By the end of his shifts, Thomas was drained beyond measure, but no mere lack of sleep could keep him from his typical seat at the end of the bar. Waiting for him nightly was his starry-eyed Marie-Louise, with ready-made hot bread, stew, and a tankard of cider. The stress of the day vanished instantaneously at the sight of her. But recently, their conversations also included Claude Labouret. Claude sought a more intimate understanding of the man who had captured his daughter's heart. He was a kind man. Thomas had actually grown rather fond of him. Unlike most of the soldiers in the inn, Thomas had a noble's education, and it stood out compared to his comrades, who could be a little rough around the edges in their mannerisms. Guillaume, for instance, was the son of a miller, and Etienne's father was a merchant. Thankfully, this stark difference was clear to Claude, who was impressed by Thomas' knowledge and etiquette. With each passing night, they formed a sort of friendship that surprised Thomas. The more he learned about the father, the more clear it became that Marie-Louise developed her revolutionary spirit genetically. She was, in many ways, a mirror of the man who sired her. But what Marie-Louise failed to see was how deeply Claude worried that her sympathies might put her in genuine danger. That was the reason why he always tried to stifle her speech. Not because Claude did not share her beliefs, but because he feared that she might bring repercussions upon herself that he would be inept to protect her from. Either way, their political conversations about justice and equality brought Thomas great joy. However, he increasingly found himself siding with Claude about their fear that Marie-Louise may push her voice too far. When treason is hushed, there is little reason to worry. But once it is heard, there is no telling what terrors may befall the loudest among them. Yet, the content of their conversations aside, Thomas' discussions with Claude also had an ulterior motive. Each day, Thomas fell more deeply in love with Marie-Louise. Claude was hardly naive to this detail. The love between them was as obvious as it was infectious. Although Thomas was always careful to maintain the socially expected propriety, he was nonetheless courting her with abandon. He brought her flowers, honey cakes, and even hired musicians to play a string quartet in the tavern on her birthday. Yet, despite all of his efforts, Claude refused to acknowledge what was clear to every other person in town. Thomas desired to marry his daughter. Thomas had attempted to broach the topic on 3 separate occasions, but each time Claude found a convenient distraction to pull himself away before Thomas could ask for his permission. Despite Claude dodging Thomas' inquiries, the couple grew closer. Sundays became a particularly special day for them, as they began to attend church together, practically announcing their courtship to the entire town. There was judgment about their relationship, certainly, but the innkeeper's daughter and the dark-skinned former noble were only small gossip compared to what was happening in Paris. One morning, as they walked back from Saint-Nicolas toward the Hôtel de l'Écu, Claude was stopped by a local merchant and became distracted in conversation. Rather than stand idly and listen to the riveting conversation about the price gouging of grain, Thomas and Marie-Louise decided to take a stroll. The sun was high in the sky, so a public promenade in the gardens of a local chateau should still be socially acceptable. With the revolution, several noble families, sensing the impending storm, hastily fled France. As a result, their estates and gardens were left open for people to wander through. As they walked, Marie-Louise held her parasol. The sun streamed through the lace, leaving elegant patterns of shadows across her face. They were careful not to be seen holding hands or being intimate. Rules were very important to Thomas, and unlike the chaos of the town meetings in the plaza, all passerbys' eyes followed them this morning. Their promenade was nowhere near as beautiful as it would have been a year before. The once pristine thoroughfares of Vieille-Cotterêts were now littered with debris and refuse. A ripped and faded French flag was caught on a tree branch, waving desperately in the distance, as if it was begging the people to remember it. Many storefronts now bore weathered signs of closure and abandonment. The bustling market square that once teemed with life lay eerily quiet as merchants shuttered their stalls for longer periods of time. The doors of the local grain stores had been ripped off and were now guarded 24 hours a day. The rising food prices had turned the streets to battlegrounds. Even Marie-Louise had made a run at the stores during one of the protests, but thankfully her father had pulled her away before she got caught. Marie-Louise stood elegantly on her tiptoes near the garden entrance. I used to stare at these gardens as a child. My father would sometimes lift me up so I could sneak a look over the hedges. How strange it is that we can just walk right in, and there is no one who cares to stop us. She tilted her head in the most lovely manner. Thomas reveled at her beauty against the overgrown gardens. The ivy was weaving through the wrought iron fence that was haphazardly falling off of its hinges. The rose bushes were no longer trimmed and elegant, but despite a clear lack of care, the gardens grew nonetheless, creeping into places where the flowers may have never belonged before. Their red and white petals spread wild beauty alongside the garden's pathways, provided one could avoid their thorns. Did you know that these gardens are where King Francis signed the law making French the official language here instead of Latin? Thomas asked. Thomas, she smirked, I have lived in Vieille-Cotterêts my whole life. Of course I did. It is the only claim our little town has to anything historically significant. So far, at least. I forgot I was walking with a scholar, he replied. Oh, I'd never let you forget that, she said, bumping against his shoulder slightly. She stopped where she stood. Can I ask you something? Thomas could tell from the look in her eyes that whatever she was going to say had been weighing on her for some time. Anything. I don't feel like I know how to ask this. I fear it's almost offensive just thinking about it, but still, I need to know. I will always be honest with you, he replied sincerely. All right. She took a deep breath. We come from different backgrounds. I know that oftentimes that is normal with couples, but we come from very different backgrounds. Our whole lives have been shaped by vastly different experiences. Would you not prefer someone who has the ability to understand you better? Are you asking why I am not trying to woo a black woman? I fear that I may be. Thomas let out a small chuckle. Well, not only are they in short supply here. He hoped to lighten the mood, but the look on her face indicated that she required a more thoughtful answer. He fiddled with a white rose that ran up the hedge. I can't explain why, but I have never felt a romantic connection to a woman who looked like my mother. But your father and those who look like him, like me, have caused you such grief. He grazed down the stem until he hit a thorn. He felt the sharpness tingle the bed of his index finger, but he didn't push down to let it bleed him. They have, but I can't change how I feel, Marie-Louise. You are beautiful, generous-hearted, and I care for you deeply. But our differences will never make things easy for us. Does that not bother you? Does it bother you? Not in the least. Then are we not in accord? Thomas looked at her carefully. Perhaps, she sighed, but I can't shake the feeling that there is something more. He paused. Well, perhaps subconsciously my heart has always deeply desired to fit in, to be worthy of the life that I am living. And you feel that a woman who looks like you could not give you that? No, of course not. I would never be so shallow. Do you only wish to be with me because I can elevate you? You must know that I cannot give my heart to that. Nor would I ask you to. I promise my feelings for you are far deeper than what lies on your flesh. I need to be certain, Thomas. Love is fickle. I've seen too many people feign adoration when, in truth, it is merely infatuation. Love isn't fickle, Marie-Louise. Love is true. You are right, of course, that some people seek it without understanding it. But I swear to you, upon my honor, that is not my heart. I do not fear difficult things, and I have no false aspersions that a courtship like ours would be free of its challenges, but my color is an important part of me, and my appreciation of it is complicated. I have long wrestled with the nuances of my feelings surrounding it. These are details that I look forward to sharing with you and opening up about. But you also need to realize that my skin is not the only part of me. His voice was almost stern. I know, she replied. She had a very strange look on her face, a little sad, but also hopeful. You and I are not so different, he said sympathetically. Tell me, truly. Well, we both have hands. He took her hand in his, gently peeling away her Sunday gloves. He studied it longingly. 5 fingers. I presume you have 5 toes, though I've never seen them. His tone was growing notably flirtatious. She laughed gently. We both have arms. Strong. She moved her hand onto his muscular bicep and squeezed slightly. The touch of her felt incredible. They were getting much closer to each other. The whole world was melting away around them. He put his hands on her waist and drew her in closer. Their faces hovered within inches of each other, fearless against the broad daylight. And we both have... His words trailed off. He suddenly couldn't remember the name for the part of her incredible figure that sat delicately under his hands. She was so thin, he could almost wrap his 2 hands around her center entirely. We do. Her fingers drifted up from his arms, gracing his shoulders, then up his neck. Neither was breathing. They were just locked in each other's eyes. Her hands brushed his neck, and he felt tingles run up his spine. He pulled her in closer and moved his hand up towards her cheek. When a sudden noise, rough and low, sliced through the silence like a cough in a confessional. Ahem! An older woman emerged from the shadows of the hedgerow, eyebrows raised in puritanical disapproval. Startled, they sprang apart, hands dropping like guilty children caught mid-mischief. Apologies, madame, Thomas said with a stiff bow, unsure whether he addressed the old woman or Marie-Louise. The villager muttered something under her breath and strode off, her skirt swishing with judgment. He needed to cool the temperature with Marie-Louise, but every part of his mind, body, and soul desired her. However, that was irrelevant in their present situation. This was dangerous. He needed safer ground, a change of topic, anything less combustible. Thomas turned to her. I noticed you began to wear the tricolored cockade. We must show support, she replied. Thomas grazed his hand over the ribbon that rested just over her heart. He looked up at her with a deep concern. Do you worry about expressing yourself so visibly? I can't risk losing you. You won't lose me, Thomas. She placed her hand over his, letting it rest on her chest. He felt her heart pulse under him. His breath shook as he pulled himself away. I've lost so many people. He gestured to a small bench, urging her to sit down. I was only a child when I lost my mother. She isn't dead, as you know, but I haven't seen her since. I lost my siblings at the same time. Then my father, There is no one left in this world who I have close to me as family. I simply can't lose you. As family? Or just a friend? He could see the yearning in her eyes. They had been skirting this conversation for far too long. They both desperately wanted to know. Would that make you happy? His voice was hushed, but keen on her response. She blushed, shadowing her face briefly with the parasol. I think my mother would have liked you. I wish you could have met her, she said. There are so many things I would tell her, things I never got a chance to say. She looked tragically forlorn, and she hadn't answered his question. He grabbed a rose off of a vine and began peeling the thorns away. The fidgeting helped calm his anxiety as he felt the green stem lodge small particles under his fingernail. He inhaled deeply. When I was growing up, my parents were never particularly affectionate. My mother always acted like she was only concerned about scholarly pursuits. Not that Saint-Domingue had much to offer on that front. And my father didn't have a sentimental bone within him. Speaking with him was no different than talking to a gargoyle on Notre Dame. I was endlessly lonely. I don't want to live like that with the people I care about. I refuse to repeat their mistakes. I intend to show affection towards the people who matter to me. He took the rose and placed it delicately in her hair, just above her ear. He smiled at her, and she steadily returned his gaze. He didn't know what to say next. He was starting to feel unsure of how he was coming off, but Marie-Louise leaned in closer. With the privacy of the gardens restored, Thomas realized that this was the first time they had truly been unchaperoned. Suddenly, he understood why polite society insisted that young couples remain visible, because he was having a profoundly difficult time adhering to appropriate expectations. He pined for her intensely, and he was unsure how much longer his decency could hold. She intrepidly put her hand on his face again. Her skin felt soft, like the petals of a flower. Their breaths quivered in harmony. He wanted to kiss her. Of course, Thomas had no idea how to kiss a woman. He was a virgin in every sense of the word. He had imagined kissing many times, and he had almost had the opportunity on a few occasions, but in the end, his lips had never indulged in that sacrosanct caress. However, in this moment, he was grateful that his first taste of a woman could be with Marie-Louise. He had never before compromised his morals around the fairer sex. But now, in the shade of the rose vines, he desperately wanted to damn this courtship to hell and pounce like a lion upon the lips of his Venus. Yet the problem remained that he was inexperienced in these matters. He had tried to glean wisdom from his more romantically seasoned friends. Etienne never talked about his personal life, which made him useless for support, but Guillaume had kissed a woman before, or at least he advertised that he had, over several tankards of ale. Some of the other dragoons had frequented brothels before and disclosed, rather bodily, about their intimacies. But this was different. Marie-Louise, Thomas began. His voice was hoarse. There's something I've been meaning to say to you. Marie-Louise looked up at him. He cleared his throat. Since the day I arrived in Villers-Cotterêts, I've been drawn to you in a way I can't quite explain. Your intelligence, your passion for justice, you have captured my heart in ways I never believed possible. You are my sun by day and my star by night. By my faith, I was in deepest darkness till you appeared and illuminated all. Thomas, I don't know what to say. I do. His voice was growing more confident. Today, the Bastille lies in rubble in the streets of Paris. Just like that fortress, you have torn down the walls around my heart, brick by brick, until all that remained was longing for you. I love you, Marie-Louise Labouret. She gasped, though a smile tugged at the corners of her mouth. Oh, Thomas, even in these dark times you have brought light to my heart. I love you too. He pulled her behind a hedge. I daren't ask, but may I kiss you? She looked around cautiously, making sure there was no one near to see them. You may, but I've never kissed anyone before. I'm afraid I won't know what to do. Well, I have kissed your hand. Is it all that different on your lips? Thomas asked. But I have never kissed anyone's hand, she whispered shakily. Do not fret. His voice was warm and low. Slowly, Thomas leaned in, his eyes never leaving hers. He gently lifted her chin with his hand, their breaths mingling in the small space between them. Trust me, he breathed. Their lips met softly at first, a tentative brush that sent a thrill through both of them. Thomas' heart raced, and he deepened the kiss, pouring all his heart into her lips. Marie-Louise pressed herself deeper, her arms wrapping around his neck, pulling him boundlessly into their embrace. When they finally broke apart, both were breathless, eyes locked in an intense, unspoken flash of passion. Thomas' hand lingered on her cheek, his thumb gently caressing her skin. He could feel his heart pounding against his chest, each beat so strong that he was certain she could sense it against her own as she serried into him. Marie-Louise's eyes glistened. She seemed on the verge of tears. Was he that bad? I'm sorry, he stammered. I didn't mean... No, Thomas, she purred. You were perfect. I've never felt anything like that before. A wave of relief blew across him. Neither have I. You have no idea how long I've wanted to do that. I imagine for as long as I have wanted it, she confessed. But I was afraid. Afraid of what? Afraid of what it would mean, she admitted, her voice barely audible. Afraid of losing you if this went wrong. Afraid of trying things I've never dared before. Afraid of all the judgment around us. I can't control much in this world, ma chérie, but I promise you, whatever happens, I'd be honored to face it by your side. Thomas grasped her hand firmly. And I by yours, she echoed. The calm of the garden enveloped them. For a moment, they simply stood there, wrapped in each other's presence. Nothing outside their little corner of the garden held any significance. Thomas pressed his forehead against hers. I have dreamed of this for so long. I almost can't believe this is real. It is real, she replied carefully, and it is good. He kissed her hand, then her forehead, and finally, once more, her lips. This kiss was different. This kiss did not hold the passion of young love, but the promise of a long one. When their lips finally parted, Thomas' future was cemented. He would not wait any longer. He would insist that Claude speak with him, for he absolutely needed to make Marie-Louise his wife. "We should go back," she sighed as she rested her head on his shoulder. He was reluctant to let her go, but he knew she was right. He released her hand, and together they began to walk back. They stood close, but were cautious not to hint to the world at the familiarity they had been lost in moments before. As they arrived back at the plaza, Claude was still deep in conversation. Thomas touched Marie-Louise's back gently. A rush of energy rippled through him as he remembered how their bodies had entwined. She glanced up at him with a radiant smile. Thomas no longer cared if France was falling to pieces around him. There was nothing in the world that could dampen the ecstasy in his heart.